the food safety coordinator at our state fair, announced over the loudspeakers that she'd just poisoned 30,000 people with hallucinogens mixed into the funnel cakes and lemonade because her daughter died from food poisoning 5 years ago, and she wanted everyone to experience chemical truth. While my sister started convulsing from the corn dog she'd eaten, but then the same woman who poisoned us gave me red pills that saved my sister's life before calmly taking notes on her victims like we were lab rats in her twisted experiment. I was halfway through my pretzel at the state fair when the loudspeakers started screeching with feedback before the fair director's voice came through. But instead of announcing the pie contest winners, his tone was pure dread. Ladies and gentlemen, I need your immediate attention. We have just received notification from the health department that needs everyone to stop eating or drinking anything purchased at this fair immediately. Put down whatever is in your hands right now. My sister dropped her corn dog mid-bite while the family next to us froze with cotton candy halfway to their mouths, and all around me thousands of people stood paralyzed holding half-eaten food. The director explained that multiple food vendors had been contaminated with a substance intentionally introduced into our supply chain that morning, and symptoms would begin appearing within the next hour, so everyone who had consumed any food or beverage needed to proceed immediately to the medical tents being set up in the parking lot. The crowd exploded into panic as parents grabbed their children and people started running in every direction while security guards tried desperately to maintain order. He told us the substance appeared to be a powerful hallucinogenic compound mixed into several base ingredients used by multiple vendors, with confirmed cases from the funnel cake stand, the lemonade booth, the barbecue pit, and at least 7 other vendors. My mouth went dry as I looked at the half-eaten pretzel in my hand, trying to remember if I'd started feeling strange or if it was just fear making my heart race. The symptoms would start with mild visual distortions, followed by severe disorientation, elevated heart rate, and potential seizures, he explained, and anyone who had eaten anything needed immediate medical evaluation, even though there were only 50 ambulances en route for potentially thousands of victims. Through the chaos, I could already see some people stumbling and grabbing onto tent poles for support, while others sat down hard on the ground holding their heads. I need to be completely honest with you all because you deserve the truth. This was not an accident. Someone deliberately poisoned our food supply in what appears to be the largest mass poisoning event in state history. A woman near the Ferris wheel started screaming that the lights were melting while her husband tried to hold her still. The person responsible was Janet Morrison, who had worked as the food safety coordinator for the past 12 years and was arrested 20 minutes ago attempting to leave the fairgrounds with detailed notes about her plan, apparently believing she was exposing the toxic food industrial complex by forcing thousands of people to experience what she called chemical enlightenment. The elderly man who'd been selling candy apples since I was a kid was now on his knees vomiting while teenagers filmed everything on their phones. We learned that Morrison had spent months planning this attack, specifically choosing a compound that would affect different people at different rates based on body weight and metabolism, timing it for the busiest day, knowing there would be over 30,000 potential victims, and now emergency responders were overwhelmed. My vision started to blur, and I couldn't tell if it was tears or the beginning of whatever was coursing through my system. The compound she used was similar to LSD, but potentially more dangerous because of the dosage uncertainty, meaning some people may have ingested massive amounts while others got trace exposure, and we wouldn't know the full extent until symptoms manifested. A father carrying his unconscious daughter pushed past me toward the medical tents while her mother stumbled behind them speaking in tongues. The director promised to stay on the microphone as long as possible to help guide us through the crisis, explaining that psychoactive effects could last anywhere from 8 to 48 hours depending on exposure level, and while medical tents had sedatives and monitoring equipment, they simply didn't have enough resources for everyone. The Ferris wheel operator had abandoned his post, and people were trapped at the top screaming about dragons in the sky, while below them the House of Mirrors had become a nightmare scene of people lost in their own reflections. Those who hadn't consumed anything were asked to help keep affected individuals safe from harm, preventing them from wandering into traffic or dangerous areas, since the compound could cause extreme paranoia and hallucinations that would seem completely real to those experiencing them. By now, the entire fairground looked like a scene from a disaster movie with thousands of people in various states of distress, while sirens wailed from every direction and helicopters circled overhead. The fair director's voice crackled through the speakers again, but this time it sounded different, like he was speaking underwater. I blinked hard, trying to focus on my sister who was swaying slightly beside me, her face pale and eyes wide. Around us, the chaos intensified as more people began showing symptoms, some laughing uncontrollably while others cowered from invisible threats. I grabbed my sister's arm to steady her, but my hand felt like it was moving through molasses. The pretzel I'd dropped lay on the ground, and for a moment it seemed to writhe like a snake before I shook my head to clear the image. My sister mumbled something about the clouds turning purple, and I realized she'd eaten more of her corn dog than I'd had of my pretzel. A security guard rushed past us toward the medical tents, and I overheard him shouting into his radio that Morrison had never made it to the police car, that she'd somehow slipped away during the initial panic. My blood ran cold, or maybe it was burning. I couldn't tell anymore as the sensations in my body began to blur together. The announcement about her arrest had been premature, and she was still somewhere on the fairgrounds. I tried to flag down another security guard to warn them, but when I opened my mouth, the words came out jumbled and slow. The guard looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear before hurrying away, clearly thinking I was just another victim of the poisoning. My sister giggled at something only she could see, and I tightened my grip on her arm, determined to get her to safety even as the ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple. The medical tents were overflowing with people, and I could see EMTs turning away those with milder symptoms to focus on the severe cases. A woman was being strapped to a gurney, her body convulsing, while nearby a teenage boy sat rocking back and forth, tears streaming down his face as he whispered about spiders crawling under his skin. I steered my sister away from the worst of it, knowing we'd have to ride this out on our own. That's when I saw her. Janet Morrison was moving through the crowd near the games area, wearing a maintenance worker's uniform she must have stolen. Even through my increasingly distorted vision, I recognized her from the employee photos posted at the fair entrance every year. She was watching the chaos with an expression of satisfaction, occasionally stopping to observe specific victims like she was conducting some twisted experiment. I tried to point her out to a passing police officer, but my arm moved in slow motion, and by the time I managed to gesture, she had melted back into the crowd. The officer barely glanced in my direction before rushing towards someone who had climbed onto the carousel and was trying to ride a painted horse that they believed was real. My sister tugged at my sleeve, insisting we needed to find the purple clouds before they disappeared. Morrison appeared again near the cotton candy stand, this time carrying a clipboard and pretending to take notes like she was part of the emergency response team. She approached a family huddled together on a bench, the parents trying to comfort their young children who were all showing different levels of symptoms. I watched in horror as she knelt beside them, speaking softly, probably telling them lies about where to find help or what to do. My legs felt like jelly as I tried to move toward them, to warn them, but the distance seemed to stretch impossibly far. Colors were starting to bleed together at the edges of my vision, and I had to stop and lean against a fence post to keep from falling. My sister had gone quiet beside me, her eyes unfocused as she stared at her own hands like she'd never seen them before. A man in a red shirt, who seemed less affected than most, noticed my distress and came over to help. He said his name was Theodore, that he'd only had a sip of lemonade before the announcement came through. I managed to communicate about Morrison through broken sentences and frantic gestures, and his eyes widened with understanding. He'd seen her too, had wondered why she was still walking around if she'd been arrested. Theodore agreed to help me keep track of Morrison while making sure my sister didn't wander off. The three of us moved slowly through the fairgrounds, which had transformed into a surreal nightmare landscape. The funhouse music still played from some attractions, mixing with sirens and screams to create a hellish symphony. Every few steps I had to stop and remind myself what was real and what was the substance playing tricks on my mind. Morrison had moved to the food court area, where she stood observing the abandoned stalls with their contaminated supplies. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing, occasionally glancing around to make sure no one was watching her too closely. The security presence had thinned as guards dealt with more immediate crises, leaving her free to move about. I watched her pick up a half-eaten funnel cake from a table, examining it like a scientist studying a specimen. The powdered sugar seemed to glow in my altered vision, pulsing with an unnatural light. I wonder what Janet Morrison's really up to here, watching everyone suffer while she takes notes like some kind of twisted scientist. Something feels off about how easily she slipped away from arrest and got that uniform so fast. Theodore whispered that we should try to get closer, to hear what she might be saying to herself, but my sister chose that moment to break free from my grip and start walking toward the Midway Games. The next few minutes blurred together as Theodore and I struggled to corral my sister while keeping Morrison in sight. She kept insisting she needed to win a stuffed animal that was calling her name, and it took both of us to guide her away from the abandoned game booths. By the time we looked back, Morrison had vanished again. The panic around us intensified as more fairgoers succumbed to the poison's effects. Theodore scanned the crowd while I held my sister's wrist tightly, her skin feeling unnaturally cold against my palm. She kept reaching for invisible butterflies, and I had to physically redirect her every few seconds to keep her from wandering into the chaos. Morrison reappeared near the livestock barn, this time wearing a different shirt and carrying a first aid kit. She moved with purpose, approaching groups of affected people and offering what looked like assistance. My stomach churned as I watched her hand out small white pills from the kit, telling people they were antidotes. The victims eagerly swallowed them, desperate for any relief. Theodore and I exchanged horrified glances. Whatever she was distributing couldn't be legitimate medicine. I tried to move faster toward her, but my legs felt disconnected from my body, each step requiring enormous concentration. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt and sway like a ship's deck in a storm. A woman who'd taken Morrison's pills suddenly collapsed, her body going rigid. Morrison simply made a note on her clipboard and moved to the next group. The calculating coldness of her actions cut through my substance-addled haze, filling me with a rage that helped me focus. My sister suddenly pulled hard against my grip, nearly breaking free. She'd spotted a snow cone stand and was convinced the ice was made of diamonds. Theodore helped me guide her to a relatively quiet spot near the petting zoo fence, where we could regroup without losing sight of Morrison. The animals in the petting zoo were agitated, sensing the chaos around them. Goats bleated frantically while rabbits huddled in corners of their pens. Even through my altered perception, I could see their fear was real, not a hallucination. My sister reached through the fence, trying to pet a goat that seemed to shimmer with rainbow colors in her vision. Morrison had now positioned herself near the main entrance, where new arrivals were still coming in, unaware of the contamination. She was turning them away, playing the role of a concerned official, but I noticed she was selective about who she warned. Families with young children were sent away, but teenagers and young adults were allowed through with no warning. Theodore pointed out that she seemed to be documenting reactions, taking special interest in how different age groups responded to the poison. She had a system, a method to her madness that went beyond simple chaos. This wasn't just about exposing people to chemicals. She was conducting a massive, unauthorized experiment on human subjects. My vision swam as I tried to process this realization. The edges of my sight pulsed with colors that shouldn't exist, and I had to close my eyes briefly to regain some equilibrium. When I opened them, my sister had managed to grab hold of a rabbit through the fence and was trying to pull it out, convinced it was made of cotton candy. Theodore helped me gently pry her fingers loose while I kept watching Morrison. She'd moved again, this time to the grandstand area where the evening's concert was supposed to happen. The stage lights were still on, creating a bizarre light show that seemed to mesmerize the affected crowd members who gravitated toward it like moths to flame. Morrison climbed onto the stage and began adjusting the lighting controls. The strobing patterns she created seemed designed to intensify the hallucinogenic effects, and I watched in horror as people in the crowd began seizing or dropping to their knees, overwhelmed by the sensory assault. I had to stop her, but my body wasn't cooperating. Each movement felt like swimming through thick syrup, and my depth perception was completely shot. Theodore suggested we try to find help, but looking around, I realized there was no one left to help us. The security guards were overwhelmed, the medical personnel were swamped, and the police were focused on crowd control at the exits. My sister had gone quiet, which worried me more than her earlier agitation. Her pupils were dilated so wide her eyes looked black, and she was staring at her hands as if they held the secrets of the universe. I shook her gently, trying to keep her grounded in reality, but she didn't respond. Morrison descended from the stage and began moving through the crowd again. This time, she was collecting items from victims: phones, wallets, personal belongings. At first, I thought she was robbing them, but then I saw her carefully labeling each item with a number that corresponded to notes in her book. She was cataloging her test subjects. The fury that built in my chest helped cut through some of the substance's effects. This woman had poisoned thousands of people, including my sister, and was now treating us like lab rats. Theodore felt it too. I could see his jaw clenching as he watched her work. We needed a plan, but thinking clearly was nearly impossible. The hallucinations were getting stronger, not weaker. The fence posts around the petting zoo looked like they were melting, and the sounds of the fair had become a cacophony of distorted noise that made my head throb. Morrison approached a group of teenagers who were sitting in a circle, holding hands and laughing at shared visions. She knelt beside them, pretending to check their vitals while actually placing something in the center of their circle. After she left, one of the teens picked up what she'd left, another vial of Hills. Theodore and I watched as they passed the vial around, each taking one. Within minutes, their laughter turned to screams. One boy began clawing at his skin while a girl ran full speed into a tent hole, knocking herself unconscious. Morrison observed from a distance, making notes. My sister suddenly spoke, her voice dreamy and disconnected. She said the rabbits were telling her secrets about Morrison, that they knew why she was doing this. I would have dismissed it as hallucination, but Theodore leaned in, interested. In our altered state, even the impossible seemed worth considering. According to my sister's rabbit conversation, Morrison had lost someone to food poisoning years ago. The rabbits knew because they'd seen her crying by their pen during last year's fair. The story was probably just my sister's substance-addled mind creating narratives, but it made a twisted kind of sense. Morrison's position as food safety coordinator would have given her both access and motivation. A commotion near the carnival rides drew our attention. Morrison was there, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a maintenance uniform was with her, helping her distribute more of her fake antidotes. My heart sank as I realized she had accomplices, people who were helping her conduct this massive experiment. Theodore recognized the man as someone who'd been working the ring toss game earlier. He must have been in on the plan from the beginning, strategically positioned to observe and assist. The scope of Morrison's planning became clearer. This wasn't a solo act of madness, but a coordinated attack. My sister tried to stand, saying she needed to tell the rabbits something important. Her legs gave out immediately, and she collapsed against me. Her skin was burning hot now, a stark contrast to the earlier coldness. The symptoms were evolving, and I had no idea if that was normal or if she'd gotten a particularly bad dose. Morrison and her accomplice split up, each taking a different section of the fairgrounds. She headed toward the arts and crafts building while he went to the 4-H barn. Theodore and I had a quick, slurred discussion about whether to follow her or try to get my sister to medical attention. The medical tents were still overwhelmed, with people being turned away unless they were actively seizing or unconscious. My sister, despite her condition, was still responsive and mobile. We decided to keep tracking Morrison while monitoring my sister's symptoms. The arts and crafts building was a maze of displays and booths, now made even more confusing by the visual distortions. Quilts on the walls seemed to breathe and pulse, their patterns shifting and swirling. Morrison moved through the aisles with purpose, stopping at specific booths to leave more of her pills. I noticed she was targeting the water stations, dropping tablets into the cups of water that volunteers had set out for people suffering from the heat. Anyone seeking relief would unknowingly dose themselves further. The calculated cruelty of it made my hands shake with anger. Theodore spotted a security radio someone had dropped. He grabbed it, trying to call for help, but the channels were chaos, overlapping voices reporting emergencies throughout the fairgrounds. When he tried to report Morrison's location, no one responded. We were on our own. My sister began humming a tune I didn't recognize, swaying slightly as she did. The melody seemed to help her focus, and she was able to walk more steadily. I kept one arm around her waist while Theodore led the way, following Morrison's path through the building. She exited through a side door that led to the animal barn area. The smell hit us immediately, a mixture of hay, manure, and something chemical that made my altered senses real. Inside, Morrison was opening animal pens, releasing confused and frightened livestock into the aisles. The chaos she created served as cover for her real purpose. While everyone scrambled to contain the animals, she accessed a storage room marked Authorized Personnel Only. Through the doorway, I glimpsed shelves of chemicals and equipment, supplies for maintaining the animal areas that could potentially be used to create more of her poison. Theodore tried to get closer, but a massive pig blocked his path, squealing and refusing to move. My sister laughed at the sight, then suddenly went rigid. Her eyes rolled back, and she began to convulse. I lowered her to the ground as gently as I could, turning her on her side as I'd seen EMTs do earlier. The seizure lasted less than a minute, but it felt like hours. When it ended, she was conscious but disoriented, unable to remember where we were or what had happened. Morrison emerged from the storage room carrying a box of supplies, stepping casually around us as if we were just another obstacle. I wanted to grab her, to stop her, but I couldn't leave my sister. Theodore made a move toward Morrison, but his coordination was too impaired. He stumbled, catching himself on a stall door as she walked past. She glanced at us with clinical interest, as if considering whether we were worth adding to her notes. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Morrison's expression shifted to annoyance. She quickened her pace, heading for the back exit of the barn. Theodore helped me get my sister to her feet, and we followed as best we could, determined not to lose sight of her again. Outside, the fairgrounds had descended into complete chaos. The Ferris wheel was still running with trapped passengers, their screams echoing across the grounds. Food vendors had abandoned their stalls, leaving grills burning and oil smoking. The acrid smell mixed with the sensory distortions made my stomach heave. Morrison met up with two more accomplices near the maintenance shed. They had a golf cart loaded with boxes, presumably more poison supplies or documentation of their experiment. She gave them quick instructions, pointing to different areas of the fairgrounds. My sister seemed to stabilize slightly, able to stand with support. She kept muttering about the rabbits warning her, about Morrison's pain and loss. Whether it was truth or hallucination, it painted a picture of someone who'd turned personal tragedy into twisted revenge against the world. Theodore suggested we try to disable their golf cart, but before we could move, one of Morrison's accomplices spotted us. He pointed us out to her, and she studied us with those cold, calculating eyes. She recognized me from earlier, saw that I'd been following her. Instead of fleeing or confronting us, she did something unexpected. She approached us slowly, reaching into her pocket. I tensed, ready to protect my sister, but she pulled out a different vial, this one marked with a red label instead of white. She held it out to me, speaking in in a calm, measured voice. She explained that this was the real antidote, that she'd never intended for anyone to die, just to experience what she called chemical truth. The red pills would counteract the worst effects, she claimed, especially for someone as young as my sister. I stared at the vial, torn between desperate hope and complete distrust. My sister was getting worse, her breathing becoming labored. Theodore shook his head, warning me not to trust anything from Morrison. But what choice did I have? The medical tents couldn't help us, and my sister needed something. Morrison set the vial on a nearby picnic table and backed away, still watching us. She said we had 5 minutes before the compound would cause permanent damage in someone my sister's size. Then she turned and walked back to her accomplices, who were starting up the golf cart. Theodore grabbed the vial before I could, examining it closely. The pills inside looked different from the white ones she'd been distributing. These were gel capsules with visible liquid inside. He pointed out that if she wanted to kill us, she'd had plenty of opportunities. Maybe this was real. My sister's convulsions started again, weaker this time, but still frightening. Her lips were turning blue, and her pulse was racing so fast I couldn't count it. The decision was being made for me by her deteriorating condition. I took one of the red pills from the vial and broke it open, smelling the contents. It had a medicinal odor, nothing like the sweet smell witnesses had reported from the poisoned food. Theodore suggested we give her half first, see if it helped before risking the full dose. Getting my sister to swallow even half the capsule was a challenge. She fought us, lost in whatever nightmare the poison had created in her mind. Finally, Theodore held her still while I managed to get the liquid into her mouth, massaging her throat to make her swallow. Morrison watched from the golf cart, making notes. Whatever happened to my sister would be just another data point in her sick experiment. The rage that filled me was pure and focused, cutting through the fog of my own symptoms. Within minutes, my sister's breathing began to steady. The blue tinge left her lips, and her pupils started to contract back to normal size. She was still hallucinating, but the physical symptoms were improving. The antidote, if that's what it was, seemed to be working. Morrison nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis, then signaled to her accomplices. The golf cart pulled away, heading toward the section of the fairgrounds where the younger children's activities were located. My blood ran cold as I realized she might be planning to dose more victims, perhaps with stronger concentrations. Theodore and I got my sister to a bench, propping her up between us. She was mumbling more coherently now, asking where she was and what had happened. The antidote had pulled her back from the edge, but she was far from recovered. I gave Theodore the rest of the red pills, telling him to find others who were in severe distress. He protested, saying we needed to stick together, but I insisted. My sister was stable enough now, and people were dying around us. He reluctantly agreed, taking half the remaining pills and heading toward the medical tents. Morrison's golf cart had stopped near the petting zoo where we'd been earlier. She was unloading boxes while her accomplices spread out, each carrying supplies. I recognized what they were doing, setting up for a second wave of poisoning, targeting those who'd avoided the first contamination. My sister gripped my arm, her clarity returning in waves. She remembered the rabbits, remembered what they'd told her about Morrison. Whether it was real or hallucination didn't matter anymore. What mattered was stopping her before she hurt more people. I helped my sister to her feet, and we began moving toward the petting zoo. My own symptoms were manageable now, the rage and adrenaline helping me focus through the visual distortions. Morrison was alone by the rabbit pen, her accomplices having spread out across the fairgrounds. She was filling water bottles from her supplies, presumably to distribute to thirsty fairgoers who'd avoided the contaminated food. The calculated patience of her actions was chilling. Even now, surrounded by the chaos she'd created, she worked methodically. My sister suddenly broke free from my grip, moving faster than I thought possible in her condition. She stumbled toward Morrison, shouting something about the rabbits knowing the truth. Morrison turned, surprised by the direct confrontation. What happened next blurred in my drugged perception. My sister grabbed Morrison's box of supplies, trying to upend it. Morrison fought back, stronger than her appearance suggested. They struggled over the box while I rushed to help, my impaired coordination making me clumsy. The box spilled, bottles and vials rolling across the ground. Some broke, their contents mixing with the dirt and hay. Morrison scrambled to salvage what she could while my sister collapsed again, the exertion too much for her poisoned system. I knelt beside my sister, checking her pulse while keeping one eye on Morrison. She'd gathered what supplies she could and was backing away, her calm demeanor finally cracking. For the first time, I saw emotion in her eyes, not regret, but frustration that her plan was being disrupted. Security guards were finally approaching our area, drawn by the commotion. Morrison saw them too and made a quick decision. She dropped her remaining supplies and walked quickly toward the maintenance area, trying to blend in with the crowd of victims and helpers. I shouted to the guards, pointing out Morrison, but my words came out slurred and confused. They assumed I was just another hallucinating victim and focused on helping my sister instead. Morrison disappeared into the crowd while I watched helplessly. Theodore returned, having distributed the antidote pills to the worst cases he could find. He helped me explain to the security guards about Morrison and the second wave of poisoning she'd been planning. This time, with Theodore's clearer speech, they listened. Radio calls went out describing Morrison and her accomplices. The maintenance shed was secured, preventing access to more chemicals. Water stations were shut down until they could be tested. Finally, the authorities were taking the ongoing threat seriously. My sister was loaded onto a golf cart to be taken to the medical area. I insisted on going with her, but Theodore stayed behind to help security identify the areas Morrison had targeted. He promised to find us later, after making sure no more poison could be distributed. The medical tent was a scene from a nightmare. Hundreds of people in various states of distress, not enough staff or supplies to help them all. My sister was triaged as stable thanks to the antidote, which meant we waited while more critical cases were treated. I held her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness, her hallucinations becoming less intense but still present. Morrison giving them the antidote raises so many questions. Why save the very people who've been tracking her? She claims it's about chemical truth, not death, but I'm not sure I buy that when she's already caused this much chaos. She kept talking about the rabbits, about Morrison's pain, about how hurt can transform into something monstrous if left to fester. Word spread through the tent about the antidote, and soon medical staff were asking where we'd gotten it. I explained about Morrison, about the red pills, about how she'd given them to us herself. The doctors exchanged worried looks. Trusting anything from the person who'd poisoned everyone seemed insane, but the evidence was clear. Those who'd received the red pills were recovering faster than those who hadn't. Whatever Morrison's twisted motivations, she'd apparently apparently created both the poison and its cure. The question was whether there was more antidote somewhere, and if so, how to find it. A detective arrived to take my statement. Through my still foggy perception, I described everything I'd seen Morrison do, every location she'd visited, every accomplice I'd noticed. He took careful notes, occasionally asking me to clarify details that seemed important. He told me they'd found Morrison's car in the parking lot, filled with research documents. Apparently, she'd been planning this for over a year, testing variations of the compound on herself to perfect the dosage. She'd documented everything, treating it like a legitimate scientific study. The documents revealed her motivation. Her daughter had died from food poisoning at a county fair 5 years ago. The investigation had been bungled. The responsible vendor never identified. Morrison had spent years working her way into positions of authority at fairs across the state, building toward this moment of revenge. My sister stirred beside me, her eyes focusing on my face. She asked if the rabbits were safe, if Morrison had hurt them. I assured her they were fine, that security was protecting all the animals now. She smiled weakly and closed her eyes again. The detective asked if I could identify Morrison's accomplices if I saw them again. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how reliable my memory would be given the circumstances. He said they were reviewing security footage, but much of it was useless due to the chaos and the fact that Morrison had likely disabled some cameras. Theodore found us an hour later, looking exhausted but more clear-eyed than before. His lower dose of the poison was wearing off faster. He reported that security had found 2 of Morrison's accomplices trying to leave through a service gate. They were in custody, but Morrison herself was still missing. The fairgrounds were being systematically searched, but with thousands of people and hundreds of hiding spots, finding one person was nearly impossible. Theodore suggested she might have had an escape plan, given how meticulously she'd planned everything else. My sister was finally seen by a doctor, who confirmed that the antidote had likely saved her life. Her vital signs were stabilizing, though she'd need observation for at least 24 hours. They wanted to analyze her blood to understand how the antidote worked. I asked about the other victims, and the doctor's expression darkened. 3 people had died so far, all from pre-existing conditions exacerbated by the poison. Dozens more were in critical condition. The final toll wouldn't be known for days. As the hours passed, my own symptoms gradually faded. The visual distortions became less intense, the physical sensations normalized, but the memory of what I'd witnessed, of Morrison's cold calculation as she observed her victims, remained crystal clear. Theodore stayed with us, helping me piece together a timeline of Morrison's movements for the investigators. We mapped out where she'd been, what she'd done, trying to identify patterns that might help predict where she'd gone. The detective returned with photos of potential accomplices pulled from security footage. I identified the 2 I'd seen with Morrison, plus 1 more I remembered from earlier. They were all fair employees, people Morrison had recruited over months or years. My sister woke again as the sun was setting, casting orange light through the tent walls. She was lucid now, the poison mostly out of her system. She didn't remember much after the initial announcement, just fragments of rabbits and colors and my face hovering over her. I told her what had happened, how Morrison had given us the antidote, how she was still out there somewhere. My sister listened quietly, then said something that chilled me. She said Morrison had whispered something to her during their struggle by the rabbit pen, something about the experiment not being over. The detective overheard and pressed for details, but my sister couldn't remember the exact words, just the tone, confident, almost triumphant, as if being caught was part of the plan. It made me wonder what else Morrison had prepared, what other surprises might be waiting. As night fell, the fairgrounds were finally being cleared. Those who could walk were sent home with medical instructions. The serious cases were transferred to hospitals. My sister and I were in the middle group, stable but needing observation. Theodore offered to drive us home once my sister was cleared, his car still in the parking lot from what felt like a lifetime ago. I accepted gratefully, not trusting myself to drive even if my car was accessible. The detective gave me his card, saying they'd need follow-up statements once everyone had recovered. He mentioned that the FBI was getting involved given the scale of the attack. Morrison had transformed from a local criminal to a domestic terrorist in the span of a day. My sister was released near midnight with strict instructions to return if any symptoms recurred. She could barely walk, leaning heavily on Theodore and me as we made our way to the parking lot. The fairgrounds looked apocalyptic in the darkness, abandoned stalls and scattered debris telling the story of the day's horror. Theodore's car was one of the few left in the lot. As we approached it, I noticed movement near the ticket booth. My substance-sensitized nerves fired, and I pulled my sister behind the car, gesturing for Theodore to do the same. Morrison emerged from the shadows, no longer in disguise. She looked exhausted, but satisfied, carrying a single bag. She walked calmly toward a motorcycle parked near the exit, apparently confident that the search had moved elsewhere. Theodore whispered that we should call the police, but I was already moving. The rage that had sustained me through the day boiled over. This woman had poisoned my sister, called innocent people, and was about to escape. I intercepted her before she reached the motorcycle, my body moving faster than my drugged mind could process. She turned at the last second, dropping her bag to defend herself. We collided, both of us going down hard on the asphalt. Morrison was stronger than she looked, fighting with desperate efficiency, but I had rage and adrenaline on my side. Theodore joined the struggle, helping me pin her down while my sister called 911 on Theodore's phone. Morrison stopped fighting once she realized she was caught. She lay still, looking up at the night sky with that same satisfied expression. She said something about her experiment being complete, about having proved what she set out to prove. I asked her what could possibly have been worth all this suffering. She smiled sadly and said that now thousands of people understood what her daughter went through, that they'd never take food safety for granted again. Her twisted logic made a horrible kind of sense. Police arrived within minutes, taking Morrison into custody. She went willingly, almost eagerly, as if being arrested was just another phase of her plan. The detective I'd spoken to earlier was among the responders, looking grimly satisfied at her capture. He took our statements there in the parking lot, my sister leaning against Theodore's car while she spoke. Morrison watched from the police car, studying us even then, probably adding final notes to her mental database. As they drove her away, I felt the adrenaline finally leave my system. The exhaustion hit like a physical weight, and I had to sit down on the curb. My sister sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. Theodore stood guard over us, making sure we were okay. The parking lot was quiet now except for distant sirens, and the sound of helicopters still circling overhead. The fair that had started as a day of simple fun had become something something none of us would ever forget. My sister asked if it was really over, if Morrison was really gone. I told her yes, though I wondered about the accomplices still out there, about the research Morrison had compiled, about whether someone else might try to continue her work. We finally made it to Theodore's car and began the drive home. The familiar streets looked alien after what we'd experienced, ordinary life seeming impossible after such extraordinary horror. My sister dozed in the back seat while I stared out the window, trying to process it all. Theodore drove in silence, understanding that words were inadequate. He'd been a stranger this morning, just another fairgoer. Now he felt like family, bonded by shared trauma and survival. As we pulled up to our house, I saw our parents' cars in the driveway. They must have heard about the attack, must be worried sick. I gently woke my sister, and we prepared to face their questions and fears. Before we got out, Theodore handed me a piece of paper with his contact information. He said to call if we needed anything, if symptoms returned, or if we just wanted to talk to someone who understood. I thanked him, meaning it more than words could express. My sister and I walked to our front door, supporting each other. Behind us, the night sky glowed faintly from the emergency lights still illuminating the fairgrounds. Morrison's experiment was over, but its effects would ripple through our community for years to come. The door opened before we could knock, our parents rushing out to embrace us. Their tears mixed with ours as we stood there, survivors of something that should never have happened. Inside, warm light and familiar voices promised safety and healing. But even as I helped my sister inside, even as I tried to reassure our parents, I couldn't shake Morrison's final words about her experiment being complete. What had she really been trying to prove? And worse, what if she'd succeeded? The morning sun filtering through our kitchen window felt like an assault on my still sensitive eyes. My sister sat across from me, mechanically eating cereal while our parents hovered nearby, watching us like we might collapse at any moment. The local news droned in the background, reporters still trying to piece together what had happened at the fairgrounds. I pushed my own breakfast around the plate, my appetite non-existent. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Morrison's satisfied smile as the police drove her away. The rage that had carried me through yesterday had faded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that sleep hadn't touched. My phone buzzed with a text from Theodore, checking in on us. He'd barely slept either, he wrote, kept awake by lingering visual distortions and the memory of what we'd witnessed. I typed back a reassurance I didn't feel, then set the phone aside as another wave of nausea rolled through me. My sister suddenly stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Our mother started to follow, but I shook my head. We'd learned overnight that sudden movements and crowding made her panic. The poison might be leaving her system, but its effects lingered in ways the doctors couldn't predict. The doorbell rang, making us all jump. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a business suit holding a clipboard. When I opened the door, she introduced herself as a health department investigator, needing follow-up information about our exposure and symptoms. I let her in, though part of me wanted to slam the door and pretend yesterday had never happened. She sat with us in the living room, asking detailed questions about what we'd eaten, when symptoms started, how they progressed. My sister struggled to answer, her memories fragmented and confused. The investigator took notes patiently, occasionally glancing at me when my sister's answers veered into descriptions of talking rabbits and melting colors. When she asked about Morrison, I felt my hands clench involuntarily. I described everything I'd witnessed, the fake antidotes, the accomplices, the systematic way she'd documented her victims. The investigator's expression grew increasingly grim as I spoke, her pen moving rapidly across the page. She revealed that they'd found Morrison's lab in her basement, a sophisticated setup where she'd been producing the compound for months. The walls were covered with charts tracking dosage calculations, symptom progressions, and demographic data. She'd been planning this for so long that she'd even tested variations on herself, building up a tolerance that explained her clarity during the chaos. My sister interrupted to ask about the rabbits at the petting zoo. The investigator looked confused until I explained my sister's hallucination about the animals knowing Morrison's motivations. To my surprise, the investigator nodded thoughtfully. They'd found photos in Morrison's house, pictures of her daughter at various fairs, including several by that same rabbit pen. The investigator left after an hour, promising to keep us updated on the investigation. As soon as the door closed, my sister retreated to her room. I followed, finding her curled on her bed, staring at nothing. I sat beside her, neither of us speaking. Sometimes there were no words for what we'd survived. Our father appeared in the doorway, holding the cordless phone. The hospital was calling. They wanted my sister to come in for additional blood work. The antidote Morrison had given us was unlike anything in their databases, and they needed to understand its composition to help other victims. The drive to the hospital was surreal. Every food truck we passed made my stomach turn. My sister kept her eyes closed the entire way, her hands trembling in her lap. Our parents exchanged worried glances in the front seat, clearly out of their depth in knowing how to help us. The hospital was chaos. The parking lot overflowed with cars, and inside, every waiting room chair was occupied by fair victims in various stages of recovery. Some rocked back and forth, still fighting off lingering hallucinations. Others sat in stunned silence, their thousand-yard stares suggesting they were reliving yesterday's horrors. A nurse recognized us from the night before and expedited our check-in. She mentioned that several people who'd received the red pills were showing remarkably faster recovery rates. Morrison's antidote, twisted as its source was, had genuinely saved lives. While my sister had blood drawn, I wandered the hallway, needing to move. I passed a room where a support group was gathering, fair victims sharing their experiences. Through the doorway, I saw Theodore among them. He caught my eye and waved me in, but I shook my head. I wasn't ready to relive it all again, not yet. Back in the waiting room, I overheard two police officers discussing the case. Morrison's accomplices were starting to talk, revealing the full scope of her plan. She'd recruited them by sharing her daughter's story, convincing them that dramatic action was the only way to force change in food safety standards. They'd believed they were part of something important, not realizing the true extent of Morrison's intentions. My sister emerged from the lab, looking drained. The technician mentioned that her blood work showed unusual markers, nothing dangerous, but evidence of how precisely Morrison had calibrated her compounds. Each victim's reaction had been slightly different, creating a massive data set that Morrison had intended to analyze. On the drive home, we passed the fairgrounds. Police tape surrounded the entire area, and cleanup crews in hazmat suits moved between the abandoned stalls. The Ferris wheel stood motionless against the sky, a monument to yesterday's nightmare. My sister turned away from the window, burying her face in her hands. That afternoon, Theodore Theodore stopped by. He looked better than he had in his text, though dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night. He'd brought food from a restaurant we all trusted, nothing from any place that might have been at the fair. The gesture was thoughtful, though none of us had much appetite. He shared what he'd learned from the support group. Some victims were experiencing flashbacks triggered by certain smells or sounds. Others couldn't eat anything without obsessively checking for contamination. The psychological effects were proving as challenging as the physical ones. My sister joined us briefly, drawn by Theodore's familiar presence. She asked if he'd heard anything about the animals from the petting zoo. He assured her they were all safe, relocated to a farm outside town until the fairgrounds could be decontaminated. This seemed to comfort her more than anything else had. As evening approached, Theodore prepared to leave. Before going, he mentioned that some victims were organizing, not for lawsuits or media attention, but simply to support each other through recovery. He left the contact information on our kitchen table, saying we could join whenever we felt ready. That night, my sister knocked on my bedroom door. She couldn't sleep, she said, kept seeing Morrison's face every time she closed her eyes. We sat together in the living room, watching mindless television to avoid thinking. Neither of us mentioned how we both flinched when a commercial for a food festival came on. The next morning brought more investigators, this time from the FBI. They needed detailed statements about Morrison's accomplices, her methods, everything we could remember. The process was exhausting, forcing us to relive each moment in excruciating detail. They revealed that Morrison had kept meticulous records of her plan, including contingencies we'd never seen implemented. She'd prepared for various scenarios: what to do if caught early, how to maximize exposure, ways to ensure her data would survive even if she didn't. The scope of her preparation was staggering. My sister struggled through her statement, her memories still fragmented. The agents were patient but thorough, gently pushing for details that might help them understand the full network Morrison had built. When they finally left, my sister looked hollow, as if the retelling had drained whatever energy she'd managed to recover. The local news ran segments about food safety, featuring experts discussing how to prevent future incidents. They carefully avoided sensationalizing Morrison's actions, focusing instead on practical information. Still, we kept the television off. The last thing we needed was to hear strangers dissecting our trauma. Days blurred together. My sister's physical symptoms faded, but she jumped at sudden noises and refused to eat anything she hadn't prepared herself. I found myself checking and rechecking expiration dates, examining packaging for any signs of tampering. Our parents watched us with growing concern, unsure how to help us move forward. A week after the fair, I finally called the number Theodore had left. The support group met at a community center, away from anything that might trigger memories. I convinced my sister to come with me, though she spent the car ride there wringing her hands nervously. The meeting room was simple, folding chairs arranged in a circle, a table with water bottles that everyone eyed suspiciously. About 20 people had gathered, all wearing the same haunted expression I saw in my own mirror each morning. Theodore smiled when he saw us, gesturing to empty chairs beside him. Why does Morrison's antidote work better than anything the hospital has? She spent months poisoning people, but somehow made a perfect cure too. That doesn't add up for someone trying to hurt everyone she could reach. The facilitator, a counselor who specialized in trauma, welcomed us warmly without pushing us to share. We could just listen, she assured us, until we felt comfortable. Others shared their experiences, not the dramatic details, but the aftermath. A mother described how her children now refuse to eat anything but packaged foods from home. A teenager talked about dropping out of culinary school, unable to trust food preparation anymore. Each story resonated with our own struggles. My sister surprised me by speaking up near the end. She didn't talk about the hallucinations or Morrison's attack. Instead, she mentioned the rabbits, how their perceived warning had helped her make sense of the chaos. Several people nodded understanding. They too had found meaning in their altered perceptions, even if those meanings were fabricated by their poisoned minds. After the meeting, a few of us lingered in the parking lot. One woman mentioned she'd started a garden, finding comfort in growing her own food. Another had switched to preparing all meals from scratch, controlling every ingredient. We were all finding ways to reclaim some sense of safety. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different silence than before, less heavy with unspoken fears. My sister mentioned maybe getting a rabbit as a pet, something that would have seemed absurd a week ago, but now made perfect sense. If hallucinated rabbits had helped her survive, perhaps real ones could help her heal. That night, I found myself in the kitchen at 2 a.m., unable to sleep. My father joined me, and we sat together in the dim light. He asked what he could do to help, and I finally admitted I didn't know. The physical poison was gone, but its psychological effects might linger for months or years. The next day brought news that Morrison had been formally charged with multiple counts of attempted murder, assault, and terrorism-related charges. Her accomplices faced lesser but still serious charges. The legal process would be long, we were warned, with trials potentially stretching out for years. My sister and I decided we didn't want to follow every development. We'd testify if needed, but dwelling on Morrison's fate wouldn't help us heal. Instead, we focused on small steps forward, her with her new pet rabbit, me with gradually expanding the foods I felt safe eating. Theodore became a regular presence in our lives, stopping by several times a week. Sometimes we talked about the fair, but more often we didn't. We'd watch movies, play board games, or just sit quietly together. Three people bound by shared trauma, finding comfort in each other's company. The fairgrounds remained closed for months while decontamination continued. There was talk of canceling next year's fair entirely, but survivor groups actually protested this. Morrison had tried to destroy something we loved. Abandoning it would mean she'd succeeded. Instead, there were plans for new safety protocols, better oversight, and a memorial for those who hadn't survived. My sister's rabbit, which she'd named Sage, became an unexpected source of healing. Caring for it gave her routine and purpose. She researched proper nutrition obsessively, channeling her food anxieties into ensuring Sage had the safest, healthiest diet possible. I returned to work after 3 weeks, though concentration remained difficult. My coworkers treated me carefully, unsure what to say about what had become known simply as the fair incident. I preferred their awkward silence to invasive questions. Months later, at another support group meeting, someone mentioned that Morrison had been transferred to a psychiatric facility after showing signs of severe mental illness. Her delusions about her daughter's death had apparently deepened, and she now believed she'd successfully transformed society's relationship with food. The news stirred mixed feelings: anger at her lack of remorse, pity for her obvious madness. My sister had started cooking again, simple things at first. She'd prepare elaborate salads for Sage, then gradually began making similar dishes for herself. Each meal prepared and safely consumed felt like a small victory over the fear Morrison had instilled. The one-year anniversary approached with media requests for interviews, all of which we declined. Instead, Theodore, my sister, and I planned a quiet gathering with others from our support group. We'd share a meal, carefully prepared, thoroughly vetted, and remember those who hadn't been as fortunate as us. The night before the anniversary, my sister found me sitting in the backyard. She sat beside me, Sage contentedly munching clover in his portable pen nearby. We didn't need to speak. We both knew what the other was thinking. Tomorrow would be hard, but we'd face it together, as we'd faced everything else since that terrible day. As the stars emerged overhead, I thought about Morrison's twisted experiment and what she'd claimed to prove. She'd wanted to force awareness of food safety through trauma, believing fear would create change. Instead, she'd only created victims who struggled daily with basic nourishment, who saw danger in every meal. But we were surviving. Not thriving yet, perhaps, but moving forward one day at a time. My sister reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture that said more than words could. We'd been poisoned, terrorized, and forever changed, but we hadn't been broken. The next morning, we woke to find our parents had prepared breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just toast and fruit, but the gesture meant everything. A year ago, we'd walked into that fair as carefree people looking for simple fun. We'd left as survivors of something unimaginable, but we'd left alive, and that was what mattered. If you want more stories like this, let me know in the comments down below. That was such a strange but somehow perfect way to take back control from what happened.